Welcome back to the podcast. Everyone is talking about God. This is your host, Damon Garcia, and this is the beginning of a brand new series of episodes. Our first little series we're trying out, a series of interviews that I did a while back, and it's all around the topic that I'm calling God after sovereignty. And it's clearly very much inspired by my favorite theologian, John Caputo's idea of God without sovereignty, but God after sovereignty, I'm calling it, because plenty of people, as they're going through their journey of deconstructing and reconstructing and trying to really think about how to approach God in the 21st century, certain categories such as sovereignty, this all-powerful Father Creator, seem to not really work as much as they did before. When we first started talking about this podcast with my friend Kayla, she was talking about how when she thinks about God at this point in her life, she can't really think about a sovereign God because she thinks of God as actually bigger than that. And that's such an interesting sentence to me because sovereign sounds like the biggest thing you could possibly think of. But it's like, no, it goes so much bigger and it goes so much deeper than just this typical sovereign authoritarian dictator in the sky. Let me, as we intro this whole series, read you this bit from John Caputo on his chapter, God Without Sovereignty, in his book, The Weakness of God. And we're going to actually interview him in another episode. This one, we're starting out with Clayton Crockett, who his quote inspired the name for the whole show. So it's a super great interview. But before we get there, let me read this. John Caputo says, "Can one imagine any more sovereign power than God's? Can one imagine anything more supportive of the established order, anything more top-down, more entrenched in the status quo, anything more immobilized, actualized, contented than religion and religion's God? Is that not a lethal combination, literally a deadly, ultra-divisive call to arms in whose ungodly name more blood has been spilled than just about anything else we can imagine? What has founded and grounded top-down orders of sovereign power more firmly than such a God? Is not the very idea of God as the sovereign Lord of the universe the very model after which every terrestrial sovereignty is designed? Is not the sovereign Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, the very model of every earthly patriarchy? How often has the reign of God meant a sovereign reign of theocratic terror? What has been more violent than theocracy? What more patriarchal, more hierarchical? What more authoritarian, inquisitorial, misogynistic, colonialist, militaristic, terroristic? And then later he says, suppose we imagine God not as a prime mover unmoved, but as removed from the order of cosmic movements and cosmological explanations, removed from the onto-causal order altogether, from being, presence, power, and causality. Suppose we imagine God otherwise, not really having a seat in being at all, but below being and beings, simmering beneath the ontico-ontological difference as the heart of a heartless world. Suppose we think of God not so much in terms of everything that we desire, which seems a little acquisitive, but in terms of everything that desires us, everything that draws us out of ourselves and calls upon us, calling from below, being to what is beyond, that summons up what is best in us, that asks us to go out of our creaturely way of being and live generously, to live and love, to live and let live, to love and to let love, to live by loving unconditionally. Suppose we hold that whatever has being can come to be only under certain conditions, while the unconditional would somehow be free from being, otherwise than being, a kind of demi-being, almost like a ghost, a very holy one, no doubt, and almost nothing. Yeah, okay. I like John Caputo because how poetic he is. A little bit of theopoetics. Shout out Tim Burnett and his podcast, who we're also going to interview later. So, get into it. Me and Gabby are going to even have a long conversation about this too. My good friend Gabby, who thinks about things pretty differently than I do, doesn't come from a Christian background that I do, but approaches things with a kind of new age type vibe. So, yeah. This will be a pretty interesting series. Get into it. What's up, everybody? It's Damon here, and I'm with my friend Gabby for this whole series. What's up, Gabby?
Hello. You can't see me do the little captain salute, but I did it.
She's giving you all a salute. And so for this whole series called God After Sovereignty, I wanted someone else to be going through these interviews with me. I did all the interviews myself, but I want to have conversations alongside these interviews and talk about like these concepts of God without sovereignty and what they're doing to our brain and thoughts and perspectives on life, because I think for a lot of you listeners out there, this stuff will be really radical. So, yeah.
Definitely some cool stuff.
Yeah, so I needed somebody else with me. And so this first interview is with Clayton Crockett. And Clayton Crockett is a professor and director of religious studies at the University of Central Arkansas. And his work focuses on postmodern theology, Continental Philosophy of Religion, Psychoanalytic Theory, and theoretical issues concerning religion and politics. He's the co-editor of the book series Insurrections, Critical Studies in Religion, Politics, and Culture for Columbia University Press. And he lives in Conway, Arkansas with his wife and 2 children. And so we did this interview through Skype from California to Arkansas. And he's extremely, extremely smart. So for those out there who may have heard all that and thought, oh, this is probably all going to be over my head, don't worry. He also explains himself very well. And so also, for those of you out there who haven't done that much deconstructing in your faith, there's a lot here that would challenge anyone's faith, I think. And so it's like, I feel like for a big chunk of this interview, he's like talking about death of God theology, the problems with sovereignty and patriotism and government, and like going that will make anyone feel like everything I've ever believed is a lie. But then at the end, it's a lot more comforting. He
brings it back. He also relates it to modern, times. So
yes.
if you're getting lost in the references to philosophers and stuff, he relates it really well to current day.
Yes.
Thanks.
Definitely. So get into it, and then we'll, on the other side of this interview, have a conversation about what Clayton Crockett is making us think about. All right.
See y'all there.
Okay, we're joined through Skype with Clayton Crockett, all the way from Conway, Arkansas. Good to see you. I'm glad you're here.
Good to be with you. Thanks, Damon.
Of course. Now, I was telling my co-host when we were talking about your work, it's funny because I'm 25 and I'm typical millennial in terms of like social media presence and stuff. And what's funny is if you were to Google your name, you wouldn't find too much. You don't have Twitter or any of that stuff. But what's funny is at the same time, your name is in like hundreds of footnotes of books and articles and essays.
Yeah.
And so it's funny, like, from one perspective, someone my age might think, who's Clayton Crockett? And I was like, well, if you read books, then you know who he is.
Yeah, I guess, I am kind of a little bit, old school and not up on all of the technology, but, really not usually interested in, sort of putting, getting out a website or putting my name out there in a way, just because I want to work on my scholarship and want to develop my ideas sort of that way. And then if there's a chance for those to sort of permeate or percolate into other areas and people take these things up and read them and talk about them. So,
yeah, people like me are putting your stuff out there on the internet. But
that's good.
Thank you. I wanted to start out by talking to you about, I'd read that you had experience of losing your faith at the end of high school. And that's definitely an experience I know a lot of our listeners can relate to.
Well, I mean, first I kind of found a kind of faith, or at least I made one up. My dad was an atheist. My mom was agnostic. They weren't religious or believers. And I just kind of decided that I believed in God. And it was a very individualistic, Protestant, voluntaristic God, but it was also literalistic. And I didn't have a community. I didn't go to church, but I felt like, I guess I needed something. And I connect that, like I have a memory that I was around 7, and that's also when my parents got divorced. So I think there's a connection there. And then I sort of had that into high school. And every time I tried to get into some kind of community, I didn't feel comfortable. But as I read more and started to engage with biblical criticism, I realized that doesn't make sense. It can't be true in the way that a majority of Protestant Christianity is presented in terms of a kind of literalistic biblical Christianity. And so that's how I lost my faith, although I was also coming to terms with some of the political things that were going on, specifically the Iran-Contra scandal in the late 1980s, and finding out things that made me very uncomfortable about some of the things our country was doing, and that might have been related to it as well. And I was also reading existentialist literature, not philosophy yet, but Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, like their novels and plays. And so that kind of developed and brought me into eventually reading of Friedrich Nietzsche, and he kind of tore me apart. But yeah.
And would you say that you just turned into an atheist? Would you use that word? Definitely not.
Really. I mean, I felt that way then. I mean, I would say that that's what I was, but it was also, I think, very nihilistic, very depressed, very much struggling with a kind of crisis of meaning. And I did two things. I took a course on Buddhism at William & Mary. I went to the College of William & Mary and majored in religion as well as history. And also I learned Buddhism. I was taught Buddhism. I practiced Buddhism. My uncle is a Zen Buddhist, and he taught me Zen meditation. And so those two things, both the practice and the study, opened me up to a kind of religion or a kind of faith or a kind of spirituality that wasn't literalistic and didn't depend on, because if it's in literal terms, I just thought, this is absurd. This is just ridiculous. So Buddhism helped me with that, and I still feel a great deal of respect and admiration, appreciation with Buddhism, even though I wouldn't call myself a Buddhist. But I also then found a way to read Western religion, specifically Christianity and Judaism, non-literalistically. And so I came across this great big book by this Catholic theologian named Hans Kung, and it was called "Does God Exist?" And I read it. I said, "Okay, I'll try."
The author's name?
And I wasn't convinced. Hans Kung. Okay. He was a liberal Roman Catholic theologian coming out of Vatican II. He was actually censored and persecuted by Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger and head of the what used to be called the Catholic Inquisition, because he wrote a book questioning the infallibility of the Pope. So Kung was one of my heroes, and he didn't convince me, but he convinced me that it was at least, it could be an intellectually honest question. And I don't understand it in terms that most religions present it. But for me, and I still feel this way, if you push as far as you can in terms of raising the question of, till it calls it ultimate reality, the universe, whatever you want to say, like if you learn and push and raise questions, you get to a limit. You get to a limit of what we can know. And then you can't prove or say like that. Some people feel like there must be something else. There must be something beyond that or before that or after that or somewhere. And some people will say, no, there doesn't need to be that. That itself is enough. And for me, I think that the more rational answer is that there's not something else. But I respect people that feel and believe that there is and must be something else, because I don't think we can resolve that on the basis of logic or reason. Does that make sense?
Definitely. And I think a lot of people today are relating with that more and more so. And I also love your definition of theology, which was a huge part of starting this podcast and the ideas and themes behind this podcast, because some people would tend to think of theology as like figuring out correct beliefs about a supreme being. But in your book, Radical Political Theology, you gave a broad definition of theology, which you even called secular theology, as any open-ended discourse about value and meaning in an ultimate sense. And that really stirred me up in a lot of ways and just stretched the whole thing wide open. So can you break down that definition of theology and how you got there?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I really appreciate that it resonates with you and with others. I was interested after my sort of crisis of faith, I was interested in studying religion. And the more I studied it, the more I gravitated to philosophical questions. Theoretical, philosophical, and even in some ways theological. And so I wanted to study what could probably best describe, in a secular sense, philosophy of religion. But because theology was so ingrained in, kind of Western Christian Protestant, conversation that was still part of so many universities and intellectual, contexts in the United States and in the world, I felt like I wanted to study theology as a way of asking questions that don't have any answers. And any time, I think, dogmatic theology is theology about dogma. It's like, here's the dogma, here's the faith, here's the pre-given answer, and then we want to find out how to justify that. But for me, it's like, what would theology mean if we question everything? Everything's up in the air, but we're trying to ask deep, profound existential questions about what it means to be alive, what it means to exist in the universe, what it means to interact with other human beings, what it means to think about good and evil, life and death, so many of those things. And so for me, and I pursued that as an intellectual, but it's not just academic. And so theology is always about asking questions and not having answers, even though for some people that's very disturbing or dangerous or threatening. Because I think a lot of people want religion to give them security in a world that's been accelerating so much, the pace of our change technologically, socially, so much turmoil, mobility, people moving around, changing jobs, again, even just kind of cycling through different social networks and groups. And so there's a lot of instability, and people, I think, feel a lot of angst and anxiety. And they want to hold on to something, they want to grasp something. And I understand that. But for me, it's not credible to sort of define that and articulate that and say, this is where we stop. This is where we're certain. This is where we dig in, because that's the dogmatism. And so for me, and I ended up studying first a little bit at the University of Virginia, and then at Syracuse University, where I got my PhD, studying and learning from people that were involved in this weird kind of theology that was called radical theology. and they were talking about, this death of God theology from the 1960s, which was kind of a fad and kind of a weird thing, but it got very popular and controversial. Time magazine did a cover in I think it was 1966. And the story was on Altizer's book, Thomas J.J. Altizer's The Gospel of Christian Atheism. But they wrote, black background with a cross, red letters, "Is God dead?" And so that's the highest selling issue of Time magazine ever. And that's a kind of an extraordinary thing. And a lot of people have forgotten that, but it kind of went underground and more into the academy and became a kind of caught up with some of the questions of French philosophy and postmodernism. And so that's where I kind of engaged it. And part of it's about developing, honing, learning these very specialized languages. But it's for me always for the purpose of trying to see if I can find tools to reflect and push these questions farther, if I can. So that open-ended theology is a kind of radical theology, is a kind of secular theology because it takes seriously the world that we live in, the world that Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, Austrian philosopher, said, the world is all that is the case. And so I accept that. The world is all that is the case. However we define it and understand it. There's no exception. There's not something outside of that. And we can think of God in the world. We can think of the world as God in some sense, but there's no sense for me in which it's credible to think about God outside the world in the biggest and broadest sense.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And so how would you explain radical theology if someone were to try to ask what's the difference between radical theology and other theologies?
Yeah. Again, radical theology is in this tradition of the death of God, because I think the death of God is something that, Nietzsche, originally in the late 19th century, he announced the death of God. And what he meant by that was not simply atheism. I mean, he was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. But what he meant was the devaluation of the highest values. That is, our highest values, not just of God, but truth and meaning and all these big things, freedom, justice, kind of get questioned in the name of those values, and they sort of undermine themselves. And we're left with the problem or the situation of nihilism. And so for Nietzsche, the challenge is what he calls transvaluation, or the creation of new values. And so that gets sort of internalized into theology, into a certain kind of Protestant theology with the death of God. But even the death of God is one step removed from Paul Tillich. And so it's really Paul Tillich who gives a lot of this language of ultimate reality, a way of taking philosophical, cultural questions seriously. And Tillich became very popular in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. And not many people were or are Tillichian in the sense of like agreeing with his systematic theology or his conclusions or what he said. But a lot of people have been inspired by Tillich to think about things in a very deep and profound sense. Because Tillich says God is not a being. God is not a personal being. He calls God being itself. Now, we don't know what being itself means, but it's a way to talk about whatever there is in the ultimate sense, or in the biggest sense, or in the broadest sense, but also in the most meaningful sense. I mean, it's not just something out there. It's also what's in our hearts, what we care about more than anything, which for many of us is something like goodness, something like justice, something like freedom, whether we use those words exactly or not. And they have a charge until it gives us this provocation to think and opens up this space where there's this encounter with the death of God. And then radical theology is like passing through the fire of the death of God, because in order to think theologically the way that I'm talking about, you have to understand and accept that God is dead. That doesn't mean God doesn't exist. What it means is the traditional image of God has to be destroyed. It has to be an idol. It has to be like impossible. It has to be broken. And that means that one's belief in a literalistic, simplistic, dogmatic way has to be like taken apart, deconstructed. That doesn't mean that you stop with that, right? Mm-hmm. But the death of God is a rite of passage for anyone that wants to call themselves radical theologians or a radical, to take seriously radical theology.
Yeah. And what's on the other side of that fire?
I don't know. I mean, that's what's so exciting and scary.
Yeah.
Is that we don't know. It's not predetermined. But there's this movement recently in philosophy that's like an embrace of speculation, kind of speculative philosophy. And if you do reach a kind of a limit in what you can know, then you can either stop thinking about it, or you might be forced to speculate. And we're in this speculative moment in philosophy, and I think in some areas of the sciences, to where we can be creative, we can be in conversation, we can imagine different ways of thinking about God, of talking about God, and even, not talking about God. Because some people say, why would you keep talking about God? And as one of my teachers, Gabriel Vahanian, said, well, God is a word in the dictionary. Like, how can you, are you going to ban words? Like, why are you afraid of the word God? Does it have this charge? Does it have this supernatural power? Right? I don't want to say, if we get rid of this one word and sort of quarantine it, everything else will be great. Because I don't think there are any safe words or safe places in which or from which to think, because it's, for me, all up in the air and it's all dangerous and risky.
Yeah, and talking about the death of this literalistic God, I wanted to read this bit from John Calvin from Institutes of the Christian Religion, because I think he kind of talks about this God that we're talking about, that of being dead, where he says, if one falls among robbers or ravenous beasts, if a sudden gust of wind at sea causes shipwreck, if one is struck down by the fall of a house or a tree, if another one wandering through desert paths meets with deliverance, or after being tossed by the waves arrives in port and makes some wondrous hairbreadth escape from death, all these occurrences, prosperous as well as adverse, carnal sense will attribute to fortune. But those who have learned from the mouth of Christ that all the hairs of his head are numbered will look farther for the cause and hold that all events whatsoever are governed by the secret counsel of God. Now, I think when people think of God, that's what they think of. And so is that the God we're talking about that's dead?
Mostly. I mean, what happens with the Protestant Reformation is this idea of God as sovereign. God is all powerful. Now, these attributes were thought about in terms of God in the Middle Ages in various different complicated ways. But what Calvin does is he takes this one attribute of power and sovereignty, and he just lifts that up, and he makes God the all-powerful being. Like, God has to be in control of everything, no matter what. And that's where he gets his idea of predestination from. So, yeah, absolutely, that God, not only that God, but that's probably one of the worst, or the one where we think about, if we read in high school, Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where it's almost like God is just like holding you over the fire and just can't wait for an excuse to drop you in. And so I think that for some believers, God becomes this kind of filter or relay for a certain kind of hate and a certain kind of justification, where you may feel like I'm a horrible person, but these other people are worse. And God is going to justify me, and God is going to get those people. They're going to get theirs. And that becomes the motivation for some forms of faith and belief, that it's more about who your enemies are than what you have in common with anyone, anywhere, and the kind of open-ended collaboration that I want to at least imagine a place for.
And I also love your critique on sovereignty, and that's one of the main things I wanted to talk about. And can you define what you mean by sovereignty and the problems with sovereignty? So,
I mean, this is the conversation, or the term is called political theology. And it becomes a significant and important conversation and way of thinking, mostly in philosophy, towards the end of the 20th century. And so political theology, though, reaches back to this German jurist Carl Schmitt, who wrote a book called Political Theology, 4 chapters on the concept of sovereignty. So for Schmitt, he says this famously, the sovereign is the one who decides on the exception. So if you have a rule of law, or if you have a situation where this is the way that things should work, and you say, okay, here's where it should apply everywhere, but here's where we're going to make an exception. Whoever has the power to do that, for Schmitt, is the sovereign. And he thought about this in personal terms. It has to be a person. And in terms of decisionism, like making a decision, cutting something off. And in political terms, deciding who's your friend and who's your enemy. These are, you have to know who your friends are and who your enemies are. And the other thing about sovereignty, or the sovereign, for Schmitt, he gets a lot of this from Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, earlier in the modern period. But the sovereign has to be one. The one God, the one king. You have this like royal absolutism during a lot of the early modern Europe as well. The one God, the one king, the one decision maker. Even if it's dispersed or spread out among, we have this idea of popular sovereignty and representational democracy. We could say sovereignty isn't necessarily in one person, but we still imagine that. And I think of George W. Bush saying, I'm the decider. Like he wasn't the decider, but there had to be that pretense that he was the decider. And then we have that with these other, authoritarian figures. Like Vladimir Putin, right? He's the guy that decides whatever happens with Russia. I mean, Xi in China, same thing. Concentration of power in his hands. Xi Jinping, and then there's this weird spectacle of absurdist authoritarianism with Donald Trump. I mean, it's almost like this weird show of mirrors, but there's almost this fantasy among some people that he would be or could be a sovereign. And so sovereignty is this idea that there has to be a stopping point. The buck stops here, and whoever it is that makes the decision, the final decision of cutting across and saying, you're with us, or you're against us. You draw that line in the sand. And what I'm trying to suggest, and I'm not the only one, because I'm following some of these philosophers, is that sovereignty can't work. It can't function in the way that Schmitt and others imagine that it could and should, because there's never one sovereign. There's never one decision maker, and the friend-enemy distinction is always in the process of breaking down and falling apart. And so if we want to talk about sovereignty, we have to talk about sovereignty in a much more complicated way and a much less personalistic way. One way would be to say, what's the sovereignty of money? What's the power of money? Like, most people don't think literally that money is God, but for many of us, money is a value. The value of having money trumps all other values, in the sense that you would trade many things if the price was right.
Yeah.
And so then, is money does money function in sovereign terms? Well, yes and no. I mean, not in the classic way, or the market, or we think about all these kinds of questions and issues. And so it's seeing how there's always been this interrelationship between how we think about religion, how we think about God, how we think about righteousness, justice, law, and how we think about politics. They're always interrelated and implicated within each other. And the fantasy of sort of keeping religion out of politics, for better or for worse, has proven not to work. And we have the rise of these fundamentalisms or neo-fundamentalisms, this religious resurgence, religious right, and that's caused a lot of people to kind of struggle with. I mean, a lot of liberals wish we could kind of get back to a kind of secularism where we can keep religion contained, or maybe even just get rid of religion because it's doing all these bad things. And that's kind of the new atheists. Mm-hmm. But I don't think even if you could, like, to get rid of religion would demand at least as much violence as religion supposedly causes, to root it out and destroy it. Because human beings are naturally religious. Part of being human is the capacity for being religious. It doesn't mean that every single person has to be religious, but every single person has that, and cognitive scientists and, evolutionary biologists have looked at sort of how this is developed and why this is. But human beings have intrinsically this kind of revert to seeing things in religious terms. And I'd rather try to understand it and work through that and acknowledge it than just to try to push it aside.
Right. And so many people who claim to not be religious still are, but just change their language.
Exactly.
Like also in Carl Schmitt's Political Theology, he said all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are actually secularized theological concepts. And so we think they're political, and because we don't have the word God in it, it's not religious, but they're just secularized versions. Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, we just substitute other things. I mean, what is patriotism? What is this notion that our nation is the greatest, is the best, is better than other nations? And so there's a deep and profound, faith there. There's a deep and profound devotion to the symbols of the country. We could think about the flag. We could think about all the things that happen. Again, I don't want to disrespect any, soldier or veteran, but the ways in which it gets talked about very much approach a kind of religious language because it's couched, it's presented in terms of a kind of awe and transcendence. Like, it's more than just, oh, thank you for doing this. We have to revere and almost, not quite, but almost worship. Well, we have to worship what they sacrificed for. We have to worship and keep holy, even if we don't use those terms, the nation and the principle of the nation, the essence of the nation, that they're fighting for and they fought for. Does that make sense? So yeah.
We see a lot of that. And back to what you were talking about, the problems of a singular sovereign person. I think some religious people may hear that and think, well, of course we can't give all power to one person. Of course it's problematic. But of course we can give it to God, as God is the almighty one singular lawgiver. Can you talk about the problems with that too?
Well, yeah, that just displaces the problem, and serves to sort of, again, in Schmidt's terms, hide it. If we're not religious or theological, or even if we are, it hides the political problems of how that manifests. And so again, it's not necessarily literally that you believe that one person should be in charge of everything, but there's the promotion of an attitude of obedience, of submission to authority, and the promotion of a kind of ignorance. Because I really genuinely believe that part of what this biblical literalism is about is getting people to sacrifice their intellect and getting people to the point where they'll believe whatever their leaders tell them. Their pastor for one, but then their political leaders and the people on Fox News that tell them what's really happening. And so I think that just to say, God is in control, God is in charge. And we always interpret the signs of the world in those terms. I think that literally, I'm not hiding my own political bias, but Donald Trump, for a lot of evangelical Christians, is literally a Messiah. Literally. Mm-hmm. In the way that for the ancient Israelites, Cyrus the Great was. They know he's not a Christian, but they believe that God is using him and working through him to promote a country and to promote a context in which the aims of conservative evangelical Christianity are advanced. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I never heard the connection with Cyrus the Great, by the way, which was super problematic for them to do that. And what's funny is those evangelicals I've heard actually connect him to King David, because it's like, oh, he had some problems along the way too. But David was like very repentant and nothing like that. But yeah, so much more like Cyrus the Great. Definitely. And there, I think about people like the new atheists or just people in general who think that we're a secular society now, or that there is religion is almost done with. But you talk about a return of religion and how, but before you talk about return, can you talk about how things got separated between religion and secularism, and then how it came back?
Yeah, so the classical sort of distinction goes back to John Locke. Mm-hmm. And in Locke's letter on toleration, he talks about how, this also goes back in a way to Luther's theology, but in Locke's sort of classical liberal form, religion is a private matter, and we want to preserve the freedom to believe, for people to believe whatever they want. But if religion enters into the public sphere, it has to adopt the tools and the categories of the secular, civil, civic, political society. It has to use the kinds of reasons and arguments and justifications that make sense in the secular realm if it's going to play that game. Otherwise, it needs to just stay and be private. So it's part of this public-private distinction that is part of the essence of modern liberalism. And so what I call secularism is the fantasy or the wish, the desire that we could completely separate the religious. It's not that religion goes away, but religion can be contained and it can just be a subjective belief, that it doesn't enter into the public sphere and the political sphere. So the return of religion never went away. So it's not back. But what happens is that some of our political categories and sociological categories especially this idea of secularism, are being overturned and undermined because of the way that religions are coming back into the public sphere in ways that we're having to deal with and take into account in new and complicated ways. And, well, I think that it's tied to a kind of breakdown of modern liberalism. Liberalism has, like, torn itself apart. Mm-hmm. And so what we have is we have a nostalgia. We call these people liberals, right? And usually that's a bad word. Even if we are liberals, usually it's not used as a nice way. Liberals have this nostalgia for classical liberalism the way that it used to be. And then we have this brutal economic neoliberalism that is the way that our economy is kind of, crushing and churning and transferring wealth from the poor to the rich. And that's been going on for decades now.
Yeah. And in this time, it seems like there's a lot of people who think that the choice is conservative or liberal, or if you critique one, then you're part of the other. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's why I think that we need that sort of radical alternative. Mm-hmm. That if it's just liberal versus conservative, then, right, we're trapped. Mm-hmm. And for me, the radical isn't another position, extremist or communist or socialist or whatever. It's basically refusing that option and imagining a different possibility and a different arrangement, because these traditional arrangements aren't even functioning anymore, except at the level of a certain kind of fantasy and a certain kind of ideological manipulation of people, because we want to think, and I mean, this is what our media does, right? Here's the position on the left, here's the position on the right, and pretend that you get to decide equally between these two things and set up elections, gerrymandering, electoral vote, all these things, to where it looks like we're divided against each other. We're not. We're not divided. It's just that we're subject to so much propaganda. Even those of us on the left, so much propaganda, to think that the people on the other side are the bad guys, are the bad people, are the stupid people, and the enemy, basically. And so part of what, for me, being, that kind of radical option is refusing that false choice, and seeing how what we called liberalism in the modern world isn't really working and functioning anymore. And we're in a different situation, at least since the early 1970s, because we're starting to hit real limits ecologically. We're starting to run into resource scarcity, and capitalism is kind of morphed into something that kind of hyper-capitalism, capitalism on steroids, because we're desperate to grow and we don't know how to function without growth. But it's harder and harder and more expensive to grow. Mm-hmm. And that can't continue forever. But there's a lot of people that believe in growth and in capitalism that in a way that feels like a faith, that feels like a kind of, there's no evidence for this, but we keep believing that this is possible. Even though the reality is, we're getting more and more unequal. We're reaching more and more, just devastating impacts and feedback loops with pollution, extinctions of animals. It's just overdevelopment. And of course, the big one, right? The big one is global warming, which there's so much money being poured in, again, a few people, right? Oh yeah, global warming is a hoax. That's not the point. The point is to raise the question in people's minds, to say, we don't know, we can't know. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. And if it is, maybe it's caused by humans, maybe it's not. And even if it is caused by humans, we don't know what to do. It's basically to create this pause, this paralysis, so that we can just continue business as usual. But the planet is not continuing business as usual. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's part of, for me, what it means to take reality seriously rather than try to live in a kind of fantasy. So it's that ecological perspective for any kind of conversation about theology, about religion, about politics, about sociality, and about morality are increasingly coming up against the hard reality of what some geologists and others are calling the Anthropocene, which is a new era of geological history that we've ushered in, which is kind of crazy, right?
Yeah.
So what does that mean? What do we do with that? How do we, think about that?
Yeah. And I think when people try to think of people who are fine with going business as usual, a lot of people think of their Christian friends, unfortunately. And I think it's because what a lot of the religious right is really just global capitalism disguised in priestly robe. And can you talk about how that happened?
It happened at different times in different ways.
Yeah.
But again, there's always been connections and intersections historically among Christianity and capitalism. William Connolly is a political scientist at Johns Hopkins who talks about, capitalism and Christianity as a kind of evangelical resonance machine that kind of, moves back and forth as a way to harness the energy of the faith of Christianity that keeps, consuming the United States in these kinds of waves of first going across, the territories and then manifest destiny, and then even after that, periodic revivals and stuff, kind of harnessing that energy and directing it and redirecting. The other thing that Christianity does for people is it individualizes it, because if all your energy and all your efforts and all your work and all your care and hope is for your own soul, that you get to go to heaven after you die, then who cares about your neighbor? Who cares about the other, even the other person in the pew? Like, if they can say they're so great, but it's all about me. Mm-hmm. And once you individualize things like that, it becomes easier to think and to feel, to practice. I mean, this is how, the sort of contemporary consumerist capitalism works. I'm an individual. I need to buy and consume things. And if I can get the right things, I'll be happy. But it's all about me. And we know that living like that doesn't make people happy. In fact, it's making us miserable. Mm-hmm. But both our economy and our theology keep nourishing and perpetuating that kind of individualism. Not that every individualism is bad, but that specific individualism is deeply problematic.
Definitely. And so would you, at this point in your life, consider yourself strictly just a scholar of religion, or are you also a practitioner of religion? Or is that also part of your life?
Again, it's not. It's what John Caputo calls, following Derrida, a religion without religion. Mm-hmm. So I would say I practice a religion without religion, in the sense of, this kind of religious faith, hope, openness, caring, and questioning, without the kind of dogmatism of having, here's the answers, here's the structures, here's the institutions. And a lot of, millennials and others who have left and are leaving institutionalized spaces and identifying more as secular, sometimes atheist, sometimes call themselves spiritual, because they want a kind of, people are hungering for a kind of spirituality, but they're not finding that in the church, they're not finding that in the denominations, and they're seeing how so much of Christian evangelicalism is just a political manipulation. Mm-hmm. And then these, recovering evangelicals, they're like, where do we go? What do we do? Do we become atheists? Do we become secularists? How do we, have and sustain meaning in our lives? And for some people, that leads to some really interesting and productive questions. And for some people, that's a really, really scary place to be. Right?
Yeah. What advice would you give to people who are in that place and it's really scary?
Well, I always feel like, and this is a kind of faith or hope maybe, that it's better to go through that darkness than to try to push it away. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite novelists, the Egyptian Nobel Prize winner Naguib Mahfouz, in his classic great book called The Children of the Alley, there's a character that says, don't be afraid of death, because the more we try to ward off death, we don't ward off death, we ward off life. Mm. And when you try to ward off and contain and keep that darkness away, what you find is you shut yourself off to the real spiritual connection and the real, if we want to use that word, transcendence, but the vital experiences of beauty and love and connection that we've all had. If we weren't loved, we wouldn't be here. We may not always feel that, right? But if someone didn't love us, we would not be alive. We know that because there have been experiments on babies, not human babies, but monkeys, that even if they get like nutrition, if they don't get care and love, they don't thrive. They just die. And so that connection is what makes life worth living. And when we try to shut out the darkness or ward off the darkness, what we do is we disconnect. And that disconnection is already a kind of death, like a death in life. We become zombies in a way, right? And so it's sort of like, how do we live in the world today? Not, like there's one way or one right answer, but how do we come to terms with all the, garbage that we experience and are exposed to? And we're searching, we're hoping, we're wondering, we're wishing. Sometimes we're idealistic, sometimes we're nihilistic, cynical, but it's about opening ourselves up to those kinds of experiences, which for me, I think lead to, maybe they don't always lead to good places, but I think part of the hope and the trust is that they can and that they do.
That's extremely helpful. And I've noticed now through a lot of the questions I ask you, and you talk about times where you had to choose between conflicts of this or that, what kept you going was by turning it into a question. And that is what drove you. And I relate with that a lot, is when we're able to I also kind of think of John Caputo's theology of perhaps, of like, when it's a perhaps, when it's a, well, let's think about it, let's keep questioning. That is, I think, way more inspiring to keep going than just picking a certain theory of belief or whatever.
Because it doesn't stop, and you don't know where it's going to lead. And sometimes the places that it takes you are so extraordinary because they're so unimaginable. That's what, for me, a sort of a real credible, vital religion is trusting that your experience and your questions and your doubts and your fears, following them will take you someplace genuine.
Definitely. That's beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. Okay.
I told y'all, I thought that interview was beautiful and amazing. What did you think, Gabby?
I have many thoughts. And they are, I would say more leaning towards praise than away from it.
Right.
Yeah. That was very insightful. Really interesting to see how a person who studies that way speaks about, what they study. And I felt like I was reading a book while he was talking.
Yeah.
It was so cool. Like, I feel like I could even, like a book on tape. That guy should do books on tape. He probably does.
Yeah, he has tons of books. And yeah, a lot of what we were talking about, he mentioned, comes from his book, Radical Political Theology, which, is way more in-depth in the stuff he was talking about. But yeah, totally. He talked about a whole lot that gives us a lot to think about. So I think it would be helpful for our listeners to even listen again. But I love the way he talks about God and spirituality, because for some, they may feel like there's only this small way of seeing God. It's funny, I call it a small way, but what I'm referring to is the understanding of God as like this powerful, omnipotent, sovereign figure who
person,
who has all of us in his hands, waiting to do whatever he likes with us. And it's so small to me when you realize that this is totally a human creation, which I have said before is, I think, based a lot on monarchy, of as we were thinking about God throughout human history and monarchies came into play, it just reflected back to that. And so, and I really loved, actually, the way he talked about theology that doesn't stop and settle with a particular dogma or belief, but a theology that chooses to constantly wrestle with questions that can't be answered. And so we're studying not to find out the answers, like so much of religion, but we're studying constantly so we can figure out how to push the questions further. What did you think about that, Gabby?
I love the idea of picturing a question like you're digging a hole and you have a shovel, and you ask the question and you start to gain a little bit deeper understanding of a concept because of the question. So you have that first scoop of the shovel. And then instead of taking that at face value and being like, well, that's that, deepening the hole, asking more questions, taking more root to that question, and finding maybe even the core of that thing. And instead of operating from a place of being right, operating from a place of curiosity. Because what is consciousness but curiosity and expression?
Yeah. Yeah, and I've felt it so often that I feel like my spirituality is way more healthy when it's about questions than answers, when it's about, like, instead of this is what I believe about this particular doctrine, spending my entire life asking, what is it about? What does so-and-so think about that part? What is the context of it? And just constantly asking questions.
Yeah, because I think it's really just helps us get to know ourselves better.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for clarity, then being right doesn't quite get you there. That maybe might get you more into an egotistical life, but that doesn't necessarily take you to a place. When you seek spirituality, you're not necessarily searching to be right, and I think that's kind of been lost over time. That focus of, instead of trying to be right, to explore oneself, and then explore yourself with each other in a community, which I think essentially was what religion is kind of supposed to be, right? Like, and he kind of addresses that, like that the structure of religion being lost over time, and I think that there's so much truth to that's, even in reflection to current day millennials. Like, a lot of people feel lost in their own selves and and confused on purpose and confused on what they're supposed to be doing. But we create ourselves, we create our environment, we create our surroundings. And he touches a little bit on manifestation and creating, but like in the sense of there being one person being creator, I don't know, I feel is a little silly because we are all creators. Mm-hmm. You know, so why make it one person that dictates all of the creation when, you know, it could just be sparks of creation and curiosity that is our consciousness manifesting through us.
Yeah, and I wish so many, even just in terms of Christianity, I wish they paid attention throughout the entire gospel stories. Is Jesus responding to everybody's questions with more questions? And whenever he's just with his disciples, the disciples are constantly asking him questions. And the end of Matthew, when he comes back from the dead and is telling his disciples, go out and make other disciples. And disciples mean students. So it's like not... And these students are always learning. So it's like, you guys are my students, go out and make more students, people who are always learning. And it even says when they saw this dude come back from the dead, some believed, or some worshipped and some doubted. And yet when he said, go out and make disciples, he was talking to all of them, even the ones who were doubting, which I think shows that's part of it. Mm-hmm. They're not the bad guys, the ones who doubt. They're a part of the whole thing. And sometimes we worship, sometimes we doubt. That's part of the whole thing.
Ooh, that brings me to, I like how... Did we touch on this? Or I think he touched on how it's not one party being right or wrong. Like when he started to go into the political place, like it's not liberals
or conservatives
against each other. It's just that's what we're made to see, and that brings me to the whole enemy thing. Yeah. How there's in sovereign religion, there's made to be an enemy, which means the focus is on fear or enemy, instead of love and gratitude and being spiritual, you know. And same thing that trickles into politics. And I also thought the topic of like separating religion from your life was really interesting, because I think obviously this is debatable, but I feel like if you're doing it right, like you should be operating like it's a moral compass. So if you're operating from those moral compasses, then it should be trickling into every aspect of your life. Maybe not like right there up front, but I think if you're aligning your belief systems with your morals, and they line up pretty well, then, you know, where you're speaking from is always going to be religious or spiritual in a sense. And and so like I think taking that enemy aspect out of it really gives us a good perspective on like how we could be living with each other and how we could be viewing each other, and then how we could be actually dictating politics and our society as a whole.
Yeah. And we're even talking earlier today about how when it's people pit groups against each other, it's like liberals versus conservatives, it's really just a distraction to distract us from doing any real change, because instead of trying to upheave the system, we're trying to just kill each other. Yeah. It like we're just distracted from the actual problem itself. It's like trying to solve a math problem, but instead of solving a math problem, we just start eating Skittles, and then we start puking them on each other, and then getting mad at each other for puking Skittles on each other. But then like the math problem just sits there never getting solved, you know? We're just fighting over Skittles. Exactly. But I also like is making me realize we all so badly want a king
or a dictator or a sovereign monarch, even though if we were ever asked, we would all say definitely not. But at the same time, I feel like there's this hint of fascism when we say things like, if we just need to get all the Republicans out of the House and the Senate, or the other side saying we just need to get all the Democrats out so we can have this one singular ruling belief and ideology and way of doing things that everyone falls under. That's fascism.
Yeah.
And not democracy. Democracy needs other perspectives in order to be democracy. And so, and it even made me think there's in the Old Testament, the Israelite tribe, when they were birthed from Abraham, God told Abraham, and then later the Israelite tribe, when they were freed from slavery, God said, I am calling you to be a nation that blesses all the other nations, a tribe that blesses all the other tribes, a family that blesses all the other families. That's the purpose of their tribe, of their nation. And yet, hundreds and hundreds of years later, as society moves beyond tribes and into kingdoms and monarchies, the tribe of Israel sees all these neighboring nations who have kings and beg God for a king too. And God continuously is like, no, I don't want you to have a king, because then you'll just end up like them and oppressing others through your kingdom in order to make a more successful kingdom, because that's how kingdoms work. And they're like, no, we want a king anyway. We want to be like everybody else. And so it's like through this guy, Samuel, and he says, all right, fine. If you want a king so bad, here's Saul, then here's David, then here's Solomon. And then it ends up tearing Israel apart, because, and eventually, even though there were a tribe of people who were freed from slavery, the Israelite king Solomon ends up building a temple for God using slaves. It's like, and so it reminds me, like, we still so often get like that, of like, even though we live in a democracy, it's like, can we just have one person that we like rule over everything and decide everything for us?
It shows us our historic patterns and our emotional patterns, because you could take that down to an individual level. And it's like, how much do you crave the things that are bad for you? And then how much do you indulge in that? Just because it helps you compensate for the feeling of feeling lost or alone or different. And then, like, how much does that actually serve you? And, you know, if your goal is to be happy or fulfilled or purposeful, then those are all really interesting patterns to start becoming aware of. And that's why learning history is important, because it teaches us, you know, what patterns we've seen throughout our known history and what has not served the human race. And I think that's an interesting thing, because it, like, to get to these places, the ones we actually want to live in, like the happy community and society that works together and solves problems and has multiple perspectives happily, it starts with us. And that means challenging ourselves to create different perspectives, and which leads us full circle back to asking more questions, like digging those holes deeper, digging those lessons deeper. Just because you learned a lesson once doesn't mean that you're done with the lesson. No, that's just the beginning. That means that you're gonna be tested, and you're gonna have that lesson come up more times. You're gonna have to really dig deep, pun intended.
Exactly.
And I think that all self-level lessons can be blown up to earth lessons, or, you know, society lessons too, and vice versa. So I think it's interesting to see how it all applies to our lives individually as well.
Yeah, and I want, throughout this series, people to not only question their idea of a sovereign God, but sovereignty in general, of feeling like we need a singular ideology to rule over everything in general. And that's why I like when he talks about, and he talks a lot about this in Radical Political Theology too, how a lot of people who say they're not religious actually still are, but just using other words like America or patriotism or
money and capitalism.
Yeah.
Of like, you still totally are religious, but just your God is now money, or your God is now America winning over everything, or your God is whatever. It's we still get trapped in these systems, and it's like I want people to be able to question all of that. Yeah.
Well, and when you break all of those systems down too, at the very core of it, of what literally makes it up is energy. And so like you're just deciding, it's like you're deciding what type of diet you're eating, you know? Are you eating the diet of spirituality? Are you eating the diet of, religion? Are you eating the diet of whatever, money, sex, power? But it's it's really, and then how your body breaks that down and digests that is really going to dictate how you feel about yourself and the world around you and the reality that you're cultivating. And then how much power you feel that you have over creating that, I think, which is why belief systems are so interesting, because they're born out of experiences and traumas and environment and so on. And so when we break it down, if it's all energy, we can manipulate our own energy. We can manipulate our thoughts, our actions, our words. We can decide if we want to be happy in one moment or sad in the next, because we can choose based off of belief systems how we interact with things. And so if you're choosing whatever to be your God, I think it's important to look and see how that affects your life, and if your body's digesting that well for you. Like if you have a bunch of diseases or you get sick all the time, I don't know, maybe check your belief systems, see what's infecting them, because I think at the point of belief is to help us cope being in a dense world and creating those connections. And when we can create those with ourselves, and become the most healthy version and most authentic version, which he touches on a little bit, then that helps us build those building blocks and digest that type of food, And to me, that seems like the healthiest kind. Seems like a nice piece of broccoli to me.
Yeah, I think it's about making it super practical and realizing, if there's a certain understanding of God or spirituality or anything that is making you unhealthy, that is clearly causing you anxiety and fear and making you not that great of a person, let it go.
Let that shit go.
Let it go. Exactly. If the understanding of God is like a literal guy in the sky with a beard who helps you get parking spots or whatever, if that is making you anxious and not making you a better person, let it go.
You don't need that parking space like that. You can walk. You probably need to walk if you're that anxious over a parking space,
And if understanding of God who is all about you over there are gonna go into paradise and you over there are gonna go into torment. If that understanding of God is just making you anxious, let it go. I think of Meister Eckhart, who said, "How long will we draw pictures of God that make us sad?" That's like,
well, and then, or if you're not comfortable with letting it go, just question the shit out of it. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if I'm cussing on this or not, but yeah, just question it, ask why. Keep asking why. Keep asking why. When you think you've asked why so many times, ask it again, and just keep taking it a step further, because then you start to become in control of creating your belief systems instead of letting them develop subconsciously through experience or trauma. And that's where you start to become the master of your reality, right? And where you can start bringing in what you actually want and need instead of what you're attracting because of whatever you've had in your life, Yeah.
And even continuing, even if you need to let go of the idea of God entirely,
let it go if it's
Yeah.
unhealthy for you. But like you just said, the thing is, don't move into a reverse fundamentalism of there is nothing else and that's it, I'm done, I've figured it out. Move into questioning of consistently questioning if there's something else. And I think
on the
that's way more
reverse
healthy.
side of that too, I think if questioning things makes you really upset and frustrated and mad, like just sit. Just stop thinking about anything. Like just take a break from thinking about things too, because I've had experience with people too who get really lost in the questioning of things and it makes them distraught and upset.
Yes.
And
yes, I'm
funny.
speaking to like the people who are too staunch in their beliefs and just stuck on one thing. But of course, there's a whole bunch of people who are just lost in questions. Those people, I would suggest simplification of their beliefs.
Yeah.
Of if you could just say, like I've heard plenty of people feel like all I could say right now is God is loving and that's it. And that's fine. Spend some time with that. Spend a few years or a few decades with that. Where you
that's
feel
a good
like
one.
all I could say is God is loving, that's it. I don't know anything else. All right, cool. Leave it at that.
Yeah.
And I think that's extremely healthy too.
I think the core of what we're saying really is just do what makes you feel good. in the healthiest way, like don't go eat like 20 pounds of hot Cheetos, or do, but I mean, not maybe in one sitting. Like we just don't want you guys to die being unhappy, right? Like one of the big purposes for this whole series too is not necessarily to get you to say, all right, I agree with everything Clayton Crockett says now, or I agree with the other people we're going to interview says now, but to get you to see you can actually talk about these subjects in way more ways than you probably thought was possible. Yeah.
That's the purpose of all this, is to get you to see actually this conversation is way wider than I ever thought. That there actually isn't just this particular way to talk about these things. There's all kinds of ways to talk about these things.
Yeah. Infinite.
Yeah, which then gives you the freedom to explore and perhaps choose a particular belief system to wrestle with your entire life. But it's more of realizing, there's so much more, and which is free to me so much. Realizing it's so much wider than what I thought.
We were talking about this earlier, but instead of kind of going from religion to the freedom thing, I kind of went from like freedom and no real belief systems, just morals, like, basic morals that I set for myself at a young age. But, and then into kind of more like what he references to like spirituality is what I call it. And then now I feel really comfortable diving into religion and looking at those belief systems because I have an understanding of how I operate, and it's helped me develop as a person and to be able to help myself and others a lot more, which I know is like one of my main purposes here. So basically that worked for me, and everybody's different, and you got to do what works for you, and trust yourself and trust the process, because it's not easy. It's hard. You're not supposed to be happy the whole time or comfortable. I think that's the point too. Make yourself hella uncomfortable.
Right.
Get so uncomfortable with the questions the things you're questioning, and because that's where the growth and kind of the deeper parts and the cores come from, is when you're not living in your little comfortable pattern bubble. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember a long time ago I started thinking differently about a particular thing the church I was in was saying, and I started talking about them with a few friends of like how this is totally not what we thought it was. And a friend of mine said, I've had those thoughts before, but I decide to not let my mind go there because it's not because I don't want to face it. And the question, and actually the subject was embracing LGBTQ people.
Whoa.
And she was like, I don't want to.
You can't not face that.
But yeah, it was like I was telling them like these verses that they say are against them actually aren't what we're talking about when we embrace LGBT people today, and they're just like, I just can't right now. It's too much.
That's interesting. But I think that's interesting because it speaks more to the person than the thing itself. Because if it makes you uncomfortable to go there, then definitely go there because you might be suppressing something.
Exactly.
I mean, you definitely are suppressing something, whether it's, what we think it is.
And we're so often, I think part of that too is so often afraid of what our community is going to say. Yeah. If we change our beliefs or if we are more honest about the beliefs that have already changed but we're hiding.
Yeah.
Which is a big deal. I know so many people like that. And we're afraid of the social consequences. But yeah, part of the reason for this podcast too is to be one of the many people out there creating little islands out there for people to jump ship from where they are and realize, if I'm more honest, I'm not going to be alone. There are people who are talking about the same things I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And it's all going to be okay.
Yeah. Woohoo.
I feel it. So there you go. That was the first episode of this series, God After Sovereignty, with the homie Gabby Perverziev.
Thank you. Well, good job on my last name. Well pronounced.
I've practiced.
Yes.
We've been friends for a while.
Yes.
All right, so I'll see you guys next week. And follow us on God Talk Pod and all that cool stuff. You already know that. All right. Bye.
Bye.